Okay, so welcome to CIEP's breakout session. CIEP is the research center of the Institute for Political Studies. I'm Andrés Vedwalves, I'm head of research at the Institute for Political Studies. My role here as host is very limited, so you will only have to endure me for a very short period of time. I'll just briefly introduce our speakers and discussants and chair, and then our chair, who is to my left side, will moderate the session. So we will have three speakers. All three are related with the significant research project, which is at the core of the findings that will be talked about in this session. So this year we have a somewhat special session. We usually have a general call for papers. This year, because we had the closure of the significant research project, we decided to devote the session to a presentation and discussion of the findings of the project. The three speakers will be, and I'll start with my colleague William Hasselberger, who's a professor here at the Institute for Political Studies. He's also head of this research project, and he's been recently nominated by the rector of the Catholic University, the director of our new LED, Digital Ethics, I was only thinking about the Portuguese expression, Digital Ethics Lab. So congratulations once again to Bill on that nomination. Then we will have also another senior researcher in the project, also a professor at the Institute of Political Studies, a specialist in security and defense and strategic studies, my colleague and good friend Francisco Proença Garcia, who will talk about the project as well in a while. And we will have one of the junior researchers with us. I'd like to thank Constanza Matos. She was an MA student at the Institute for Political Studies, and she was one of the junior researchers who was working in this project, and we're very glad to have her with us. We'll then have two discussants. First, I'd like to introduce Carlos Guimarães Pinto, who will be joining us via video. Carlos, in addition to being a visiting professor at the Institute for Political Studies, has also recently formed and become the director of a think tank, Mais Liberdade. And we have a long-standing relationship also with Carlos. And the second discussant is my colleague and good friend José Tomás Castelo Branco, professor here at the Institute for Political Studies, and also researcher at CIEP. Finally, last but certainly not least, the chair for the session will be my colleague Inês Gregório. Inês is executive coordinator at the research center. She has recently completed her PhD, so she's also now a professor with us at the Institute for Political Studies, and she will be moderating the session, making sure everyone sticks to their time and that we have time for open discussion with the audience at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I guess we are not losing any time here, and we are just starting with Professor Francisco Proença Garcia, who is making the first presentation.
So, can you please now show the first presentation? So, good afternoon to all. I'm going to explain you the project in a broad perspective. We have. This is the name of the project, the Rising Powers, and we had the team. This was the team, okay? We had 6 students, 3 from PhD students and 3 from MA students, and they cooperate with us during 14 months, okay? And Bill and myself, we tried to coordinate this project. So, we investigated what? Contemporary challenges to contemporary democracy. Our topics of interest range from sophisticated technological tools to economic statecraft, misinformation campaigns, and foreign interference. Our main focus concerns authoritarian challenges in Portugal and within the European Union. As the outreach, let me just show you, it's here. we created a seminar for our MA and the PhD students in the Institute. We also publish 6 academic papers that I will present them. At least one of them is mine. 7 op-eds in the Portuguese media, 2 master theses, and 8 international seminars. The main areas of the study were those shown in the slide: authoritarian and artificial intelligence and cyber surveillance, these and misinformation campaigns, and economic statecraft. Okay. So, I now show you the results, the scientific results of the project. This one about the Chinese economic presence in Mozambique was published in a Brazilian journal, Estudos Internacionais, Revista de Relações Internacionais, from the Catholic University of Minas. Why did we choose Mozambique? Because we go there often, as you know. Even yesterday we had here a panel about Africa, and we have huge cooperation with Mozambique. And in one of my visits, I realized this bridge, for instance, is an amazing bridge. It's like our Ponte 25 de Abril. It's visible that Chinese are there. They pay almost $1 billion for this bridge. So their presence is visible, but we want to learn where they are investing and try to understand if this investment has some relationship with the political regime in Mozambique. And we found some connections because their presence is really visible. The other paper, also from my responsibility, from Lieutenant General Fontes Ramos and Manuel Puejo, is written in Portuguese. We presented this in a conference in Madrid and also in CIEP. We had presented this as a research paper, but finally it was published in Portugal in Revista de Relações Internacionais from Nova University. And the main subject of this paper is the future of NATO, the challenge ahead that NATO faces, and we have a chapter about the possible relations between NATO and China and the connections between NATO and China Cooperation Organization, because they not have any way, any channel of communication. It's a huge organization, bigger than NATO. It has, in this organization, we have Russia, we have India, we have China, we have Iran, and nobody talks with them. We don't know what they want, what they do, but last year they've performed the biggest military exercise in military history. With thousands and thousands of soldiers from those countries, and NATO do not even have any information about this. We do not have even a liaison officer with this organization. So in this paper, we analyze the role of NATO and the connection and the possible connection with China. I only talk about those 2 papers because I participate directly in those 2 papers. Then Manuel presented state surveillance. How is face recognition technology impacting in political, juridical landscape? Manuel presented this in the law school from Lisbon University. Then Pamela presented this paper about Angola. The presence, the second paper was presented by Pamela, tried to not to copy my idea on Mozambique, but try to have an idea of the relations between Angola and China. And as you know, it's a very complex connection, and Pamela analyzed it deeply. Then Luis, we have more papers. Luis presented this paper, the EU leading role in opposing China, threats to the liberal and international order. It's now for revision to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. Constanza, she will explain. She will have time to explain this in a later stage today. And we also have 2 MA thesis. But Pamela, once again, focused on the role of China in all Lusophone Africa, and Maria related with the future is now, liberal democracies and the challenges of AI, artificial intelligence. Bill will explain a little bit on this because his topic today is about this. So, and finally, tomorrow we will present a book. We have the pleasure to have Professor Owen with the preface of the study. Will be presented here tomorrow, officially, and a e-book, and then we will have it in paper and also in Portuguese. We are working on the translation now, and every student wrote his own chapter. Okay, you have there the chapters: Constanza, Pamela, Luís, and we will have this presentation tomorrow. So more on the results of the project. We have then several op-eds. Okay, Luís published in Observador. Corina wrote an interesting paper about op-ed about Moldavia in Público. Then Constanza in Nova Cidadania, and Corina again in Nova Cidadania, more connected either to authoritarian interference in Western democracies, and the other connected to 5G and the connections with the geopolitical implications in EU. Luís published another op-ed in Observador. This one focused on the economy and the numbers of the foreign investment that China has in EU, mainly in EU. We have also 2 or 3 paragraphs about Portugal and a specific study for Portugal, but this op-ed is focused mainly on EU. Then Constanza, again, she will have time today to explain the ideas about the role of their role even in universities. It's very interesting. And finally, Pamela, again, China in Africa. Okay, in Nova Cidadania. Nova Cidadania is our journal from IEP. Then we also have, we started last year in IEP presenting several working papers. We had several sections on the IEP CIEP, Estoril Political Forum, and we presented several working papers. Then we had several webinars within CIEP, as you can see here, okay, with Zach Cooper, another with Samantha Hoffman. Then we have, we presented my paper with the General and Manuel Torres. We had Professor John Owen once also presenting or giving his contributions to CIEP, and a final CIEP seminar with 2 of the students, Corina and Pamela. Okay. Then we also created the seminar for MA and PhD students about this subject, and you have it here, the topics, okay? Modern geopolitics, the future of democracy, China and the liberal international order, and so on and so on and so on. You have the details on the report. And those are the metrics. We created a web page inside CIEP web page, and we have some metrics on the results from our research, okay? You have the average visits in the page, in which paper, and so on and so on, and also in social network, okay? We have all this, and finally you have the project key takeaways. The first, democracy is a continuous process of discovering, consolidating change, resilience, resistance, and reinventation. Second, democracy long-term survival requires widespread cooperation, and Europe has a significant role to play in the coming years. Those were the key takeaways of the project. So, And that's it. It took us 14 months to analyze, and this is the result of our project.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this brief but very clear presentation of this important research project. I'll now give the floor to Professor William Hasselberger.
Thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to say is that I hope that this is a example of potential for future graduate student projects at the Catholic University of Portugal that can integrate the graduate students in research teams and get them to write articles and give them editorial guidance and publishing op-eds and how to get things published and how to send things to journals and how to put a book together and all of those topics. I hope that, I think it was helpful for the graduate students, and I hope we can continue to do this so that CIEP can continue to play a role in guiding graduate students in this way. I'm going to talk briefly today about a specific topic. So that was the sort of overview of the project from a kind of project management perspective in a way. I'd like to talk about a specific area that we researched and that I researched in the project and that Maria Cortizão Monteiro researched quite substantially and in fact wrote a thesis about, which is the rise of a new form of high-tech authoritarian AI-powered surveillance and the way that this is changing well, the global order in many respects and even having an effect within liberal democracies themselves. So I'd like to start with a historical point of historical departure. So I'd like to go back a couple decades and compare a previous moment with where we are now, because I think this is illuminating to how much has changed and what has changed in the last 2 decades. So in the year 2000, American President Bill Clinton gave a speech at Johns Hopkins University arguing in favor of trade liberalization with China and on behalf of China's entry into the World Trade Organization. What's particularly interesting about this speech is that it expresses a certain political thesis and hope that, and beyond China in particular, about for the future of the globe. The thesis and the hope was that economic liberalization, free trade, globalization, and especially the spread of the internet and digital technologies would lead to greater political liberty around the world. This is at a time when Russia was still emerging from the chaos of the Yeltsin years, when China's economy was merely 1.2 trillion, or only 3% of global GDP, and in which liberalism was sort of ascendant, right? And it seemed quite natural to assume that technology, trade, economic interdependence would lead naturally to political rights around the world. Clinton said, quote, "In the new century, liberty will spread by cell phone and cable modem," end quote. And then he was asked about, or he was considered the possibility that digital technologies and the internet could also be used as tools of censorship and repression. Clinton said the following, quote, "Now there's no question China has been trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck," laughter, there's laughter in the room at the time. "That's sort of like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall." Okay, now let's jump ahead 20 years. 2 symbolic public pronouncements capture, I think, the current moment. One from the Financial Times, an interview with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, in which he announced, quote, "The liberal idea has become obsolete," end quote. And then the other from the People's Daily, which is a Chinese Communist Party newspaper, which writes in English, meant for consumption abroad, quotes Chinese President Xi Jinping offering a pretty clear geopolitical arithmetic, quote, "The East is rising and the West is declining," end quote. So I think it's most analysts argue that Clinton was fundamentally mistaken in his predictions. Clearly, there has been an enormous amount of economic growth, especially in particular in China. Its economy is roughly 12 times as large as it was in 2000. So roughly 18% of the global economy, from 3% to 18% of the global economy. It's also a major power in artificial intelligence research. In fact, only second to or in competition with the United States in terms of the development of the most advanced forms of artificial intelligence technology. But I think so Clinton may have, we can talk about Russia and maybe what he got wrong there, but what I'd like to focus on is the nailing Jell-O to a wall idea. So I think that it's become clear that the development of advanced technology, in particular AI and digital surveillance, and the economic interdependence and globalization did not lead to political liberalization in China or many other places. In fact, many analysts think that the last few years have seen the creation of an unprecedented high-technology authoritarian infrastructure of social monitoring and control in China, and then also in other countries beyond China's borders, often in cooperation with China. So I think what I'd like to describe is the basic structure of a new regime type that did not really exist in the 20th century. This is not the kind of backwards, isolated dictatorship kind of the 20th century. What we're talking about is an economically a wealthy, dynamic, globalized economy that is deeply integrated in the global economy and that is very high tech, but that also has a unprecedented kind of digital surveillance infrastructure with, I think, three key elements that are worth focusing on. First, against, again, the Jell-O on the wall claim, the so-called Great Firewall of China. This is the fact that China has led the world and helped other authoritarian countries develop a new form of autocratic internet governance that involves widespread internet censorship, thousands of sites and apps blocked, search terms blocked within China. It wasn't like nailing Jell-O to a wall. And moreover, a network of AI bots that can produce quite believable content, quite believable language in social media forums or in comment threads online to, say, troll particular people or push a particular propaganda line. So a closed, surveilled, but still dynamic internet structure. Second, a massive apparatus of surveillance cameras, around 415 million state-owned surveillance cameras, many of which involve facial recognition technology, which is a form of biometric identification that uses scanning of the structure of someone's face from afar without their knowledge, along with license plate tracking technology and other mass data collection technologies. We see similar things, unfortunately, arising also in the West, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Lastly, and let me say one other thing about this mass surveillance structure. In an autocracy, the state can gain access to diverse sources of data about people, from medical records, police records, insurance records, facial recognition, biometric records, and can centralize them and create kind of centralized state databases that collate information about people, that collect them all together into a centralized sort of database. This has enabled a third feature, which is the rise of something called the social credit system. So in 2014, the China State Council announced its, quote, outline for the promotion of a system of social credit, end quote, which was a plan for using big data to essentially score citizens in order to, quote, encourage sincerity and punish insincerity. This language comes from the state's own public pronouncement. This involves private companies like Ant Financial's Sesame Credit, as well as many, many local initiatives. This is not a single thing, the social credit system. It's in fact many local systems that have different sort of trustworthiness scoring metrics, some say 5 stars, some other points, but one thing about artificial intelligence that's become clear over the last few years is its tendency is to, the technology itself seems to almost want to centralize, right? It's more powerful to the extent that AI becomes more powerful to the extent that it has more data and more diverse sources of data. So if you can centralize digital information from a variety of sources, you can use AI to make more effective predictions about what people will do. Okay, so let me say one philosophical point. I'm really a philosopher. I'm not a international relations theorist. So one thing that strikes me as philosophically interesting about this new kind of high-tech, wealthy autocracy, which has not really existed before, is whether it gets around a problem described by the great Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek in his seminal article, The Uses of Knowledge in Society. This is the problem that within social orders that are highly centralized and administered like autocracies, local grassroots knowledge from private individuals and groups tends not to make it to the central authorities in a balanced, uncorrupted, and timely way, argued Hayek. He argued that in such systems, central authorities lack the necessary conduits of local information for really sound decision-making, especially in the economic sphere, but not only in the economic sphere. So this lack of accurate local knowledge on a Hayekian account was a fatal flaw of the Soviet communist system, leading to massively inefficient decisions based on abstract scientific theories and politicized data. Does the new high-tech regime of autocracy, AI autocracy, get around the knowledge problem? Does it show that Hayek actually was wrong to think that centralized surveillance and control and sort of command of the economy and society will produce massive knowledge problems and inefficiencies? I don't know. It's an interesting question whether or not this is a survivable, serious alternative to an open society that can still produce economic growth, and innovation and dynamism. Basically, what we see is a system that involves select market inputs, select elements of the free market, together with large-scale state ownership of various industries, mass surveillance, and advanced statistical analysis. With these tools, a new kind of AI authoritarian state seeks to direct resources, gauge popular sentiment, manage information, manage media narratives, suppress dissent, and thereby overcome the fragility and governance problems that plagued traditional dictatorships in the past. Okay, last point, and then I'll stop. This system this new system of centralized autocratic power is spreading. All right, so we're finding advanced forms of facial recognition and data collection technologies popping up around the world. Censored forms of the internet are being explored by countries around the world, including, unfortunately, I am sorry to say, Turkey, where I was born, and it's a place that I'm close to my heart, but Turkey has something like 47,000 censored websites. Russia is exploring a model of a kind of closed, censored, surveilled internet to get around worries about open information there. So my question is, can democracies both stay entrepreneurial and innovative and also democratic in an emerging kind of global order that's kind of replete with mass surveillance infrastructure? How can democracies maintain their openness in this kind of context? AI tends towards centralized systems, tends to empower centralized systems, and it tends to work in a black box fashion that is often unaccountable and invisible to citizens. This, I think, is also happening in the West. I don't want to sound like I'm beating up on one particular country. We're seeing a kind of drift towards this kind of data analytics and technology, even in the West, including smart city projects in Europe. So I guess I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such an interesting contribution. Constanza, you're next.
Thank you, Ines, for the introduction. Well, I'll be speaking about the future of the democratic model and how rising authoritarian powers are challenging the democratic ideal in the 21st century. Mouthful. It's the first chapter of the book. It's a bit more theoretical and political chapter, so just heads up. And I won't really be speaking about my research on academic freedom, but feel free to ask about that during the Q&A or in the break. Sorry, should I use this? Yeah. So the idea for this topic really came from a Philip C. Schmitter article in the Journal of Democracy in 2015 that I came across during my research, and where he states that although there seems to be a massive consensus among scholars and politicians that as a practice, democracy is in decline, or at least in retreat, as an ideal, however, it has never been greater or more broadly distributed. And it really got me thinking about whether this is still the case, in the present circumstances and the present time. It also got me thinking about, so two main questions are, to what extent has democracy as an ideal been challenged, affected, weakened by the efforts of rising authoritarian powers, and how do those challenges to the democratic ideal in particular affect the democratic model in the long term? Oh, sorry. So first of all, I think it's important to make to clarify the distinction, the dichotomy between democracy as a practice versus democracy as an ideal. The first really represents what is actually happening on the ground, and so a sort of more objective dimension of democratic performance that can be more easily measured and quantified. So talking about like Freedom House and all these indexes and reports. Versus democracy as an ideal, which is more of the realm of perception, I would say. So the standing of democracy in the world and a sort of more subjective and ideological dimension. So to frame the work, I think it's still important to talk about democratic practice and what is the state of democratic practice around the world. As all of you may know, and obviously you will know, all reliable indexes and reports are very discouraging, have present us with really very discouraging and grim data. According to Freedom House, for instance, 2021 was the 15th consecutive year of worldwide democratic decline. They emphasize that democratic deterioration has become increasingly global in nature, broad enough to be felt by those living under the cruelest dictatorships, as well as by citizens of long-standing democracies. The Economist Intelligence Unit has an even more grim scenario, I would say, a gloomier perspective. So in 2021, the index global average score hit an all-time low. And there's also an emphasis on the effects of COVID-19 measures around the world. But here comes the question. So does this affect democracy as an ideal, and does that mean that democracy as an ideal is also in danger? Well, it's very hard to quantify perception. It's not the same as Freedom House and those others, although they do try to quantify it to a certain point. But I would say it's interesting the data comes from the Democracy Perception Index. And what they say is that in 2018, for instance, public disillusionment with democracy was as high as 64% in democratic settings, and that 54% of people living in democracies worldwide think their voice is rarely or never heard in politics. In 2021, 28% of people agree that Russia's influence constitutes a threat to democracies, and the same goes for 38% goes for China's influence as a threat to democracies. And really, I think these numbers really translate and represent the feeling, the suspicions that we have about our societies right now in the present time. Our feelings about democratic performance. So it's interesting to keep in mind, I would say. And so with this in mind, I tried to answer the question of how do these threats of rising authoritarian powers challenge the democratic ideal in particular? And one of the ways they do so, I think, is by creating alternative global institutional arrangements. And they do so by seizing control in established international organizations. Here I have the example of Beijing's growing ambitions within the UN. But they also do that by the desire to create an alternative institutional arrangement to those which were created in the aftermath of the Second World War by the Allies. And it's important to say that I think they have the legitimacy to do so, of course, as rising powers, the ambition to create a space where they can not manipulate, but pertain their ambitions in the international community in a way that can better and successfully do so. And that is very interesting to us, but it still poses a threat, I think, or a challenge at least, to the democratic ideal. Some of the examples are the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the New Development Bank, also known as the BRICS Bank, informally, Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and among others. Yeah, and so I believe that a shift towards a non-liberal global paradigm would likely pose a significant challenge to the ideal of democracy globally. This isn't a consensus, though. There are many discussions on this. But from my perspective, I think that even if the hegemon did not promote an actively hostile environment towards democracies, it's fair to assume that it would not, for instance, actively promote liberal values, and that the ideal of democracy would be championed by weakened Western powers. And so consequently, I think that authoritarian propaganda would likely fill the existing ideological void with many consequences. Now, a second way that rising authoritarian powers can threaten and challenge the democratic ideal is also by creating alternative and non-democratic regime types that go from quasi-totalitarian to hybrid regime types. And here I give two examples of that. So the China model, which is perhaps the biggest threat to liberal democracies in the 21st century, and that's whose political legitimacy and success is really embedded in its economic success. And so we have success of its state-led hybrid command economy, how it poses an alternative to Western capitalism and the free market, and also its wide-ranging state-led initiatives at home and abroad. But we also have this other type, this hybrid regime types, namely soft authoritarianism. It was very much used in the 90s to focus on some Asian regimes like mainly Singapore, but also a liberal democracy, which we know very well in these present times, and which I believe can really pose a very much disproportionate threat to democracy, especially within democratic settings like the European Union. And this is why we have the example of Viktor Orban's regime in Hungary, with actively undermining democratic processes, subverting the ideal of democracy, and destabilizing an otherwise democratic region. And how do they specifically undermine the democratic ideal? I would say they provide a very credible, non-liberal alternative standard for dealing with political, economic, and social issues in the world. Now, still within this scope, it's, I think, extremely important to talk about public perception and public opinion, and rising authoritarian power's capacity to generate a positive narrative of strength, which isn't necessarily 100% accurate, I would say. One of the examples is the Chinese regime's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, for sure, namely with building hospitals in record time, controlling the virus with very strict lockdowns and formulating a vaccine before Western powers. But we tend to forget that they do so by resorting to non-liberal practices. So it's not always a very fair comparison, I would say. And it really got me thinking about a Huntington quote from 1991 that says, "As memories of authoritarian failures fade, irritation with democratic failures is likely to increase." Now, finally, the third way that I've kind of introduced as to how rising authoritarian powers challenge the democratic ideal is really by actively discrediting democracy, which has a lot to do with the public perception and public opinion part that I explained earlier, namely by internal and external use of state-led propaganda. Just so you know, I think the estimate of the Chinese propaganda budget is supposed to be around $8 billion, if I'm not mistaken, annually. Disinformation campaigns, which you are tired to know about, I guess, and attempts to influence democratic elections. I mean, you'll recall the Mueller report's conclusions. What they do is they further instill doubt and discord when we should strive for truth and trust. They affect the public perception of democratic effectiveness, which doesn't always correspond to the truth, and really to just promote the erosion of the structural pillars of democracy, namely accountability and pluralism and so on. And so finally, just some really small and key takeaways from this very resumed presentation. So there's a link between, I think there's a big and effective link between democratic performance and the democratic ideal. So one affects the other and vice versa. That the future of the democratic model is dependent on both the resilience of the liberal international order and democracy as an ideal. So the standing of democracy in the world, its attractiveness, I would say, to other countries that are transitioning or that wish to do so. And also just how the power of perception directly influences the standing of democracy in the world. And so I end with another Samuel Huntington quote from 1991. I think he was spot on when he said this. And he's talking about the United States in particular, and it makes sense, but I would also say that it also makes sense for Europe and the European Union. And he says that if people around the world come to see the United States as a fading power beset by political stagnation, economic inefficiency, and social chaos, its perceived failures will inevitably be seen as the failures of democracy, and the worldwide appeal of democracy will diminish. And so I think we have to strive not to let that happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Constanze, for this reflection on where democratic regimes standing nowadays. So we finished the first part of our session, I'd say. So after the presentations of our main three speakers of their papers and arguments, we will now proceed with the discussants. And I will give the floor first to Carlos Guimarães-Pinto. Please.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I must say that I'm not a political scientist. Well, I would even challenge if that expression political science is not an oxymoron, but that's not the time nor the audience to say this. So I'm an economist, and I'm also interested in evolutionary biology, and I will speak as someone who is interested in these two topics, and as someone who is interested in evolutionary biology, I must say that democracy, regardless of our wishes, is yet to pass the test of time, especially liberal democracies. It's something extremely recent in human history. It's both in terms of time and space. A minority, a very small minority of regimes were liberal democracies. It's something extremely recent, and as such, we cannot state that will be a final end, that liberal democracies will stay forever. Regardless of what we wish, regardless of what we would like for the future, we cannot state that will be the end of it. It has not passed the test of time. Actually, autocracies have been around for much longer and have been proven to be more resilient. This is a statement of fact. We've had autocracies for much longer than we've had democracies. Democracies are vulnerable, much more vulnerable, and illiberal autocracies have proven to be more resilient than any other type of system, which doesn't mean that we will not have more liberal democracies over time. But if we look at it from a purely evolutionary standpoint, democracies have proven that in order to survive, you need two things. You need to have the capability to survive yourself and capability to reproduce. And if you would make this question 60 or 70 years ago, you would say, yes, looks like liberal democracies have a high reproductive capabilities. They are expanding. We have more and more liberal democracies. So there seems to be some capability to reproduce, to expand liberal democracies. From what we've heard here so far, that does not seem to be the case anymore. Liberal democracies have been receding. We've seen even those ones that are already liberal democracies, they seem to be going backwards. They seem to be losing some of the principles of liberal democracy. So we do have a challenge there, and liberal democracies effectively are at risk. That being said, and I wanted to state this, I think it's the first point, that indeed I agree that there is at risk, and I would strengthen that point saying that it's not sure yet. Democracies are yet to pass the test of time. That being said, there's two things that are important, which is, first, is when we see a technological revolution as a potential threat to liberal democracies, or something that will help autocracies to gain a bit more power. I understand that point, but I don't see it as something new. Every technological revolution in the past has given more powers to potential autocracies, to existing autocracies, and to potential autocracies. It has given more power to aspiring autocrats. We can think about things as far off in the past as gunpowder. Gunpowder gave an immense additional power to any aspirational autocrat. We don't need to say why there's that power. The fact that you can control more people through gun violence has given an immense marginal increase in your potential to exert power over large shares of population. After that, the early computing, the early advances in computing, and early mass media, radio and TV, has given unprecedented ways to control population. If we think about that, marginally going from nothing to have radio, marginally has given a lot more power to potential autocrats than moving from radio and TV, as we had 20 years ago, to the internet. A lot more. I'm speaking about marginally. There was no way to speak to large shares of the population before we had radio and TV, and internet came at a point where we already, where politicians, where leaders, where autocratic leaders already had a way to reach most of the population, which was radio and TV. So marginally, I don't think this, the difference, the additional, the incremental power that internet brought to autocracies is higher than what has happened in the past. So this is really nothing new. So if I think about it in the very long term, if you ask me if this technological revolution will mean that in 100 years we'll be more prone towards autocracy, I would say no. Because we have been able to adapt to higher or stronger technological revolutions in the past, and the reaction to the gains in autocracy powers, in the powers of autocracies, has been eventually diluted. Now, but I cannot say the same about the next 50 years. Which is really what matters, because it's the time frame relevant for all of us in the room and for our children. It's what is going to happen in the next 50 years. And I cannot be certain that in this transition period, in which we are not able to adapt and to absorb all these shocks, will not mean that there will be challenges to liberal democracies. In this case, I do believe that liberal democracy will face huge challenges over the next 20, 30 years. The technological revolution, the capability to identify people, to manage data, to process data in a much faster, in almost real time, will give more possibilities to autocrats to have a different type of power. The fact that we don't know yet how to manage the threats from that autocrats can use social networks, can use large data manipulation techniques, will indeed, and I believe so, pose a threat to liberal democracies. Up to this moment, democracy is not a rule in the world. Democracy is still an exception, both in time and space. And we are in that fine spot in liberal democracies in the Western world, where the memory of autocracies are already a very far scenario. Most of the countries in Western Europe, most of the collective memory does not remember anymore what was to live in an autocracy. We take democracy for granted. So we are in that fine spot where we take democracy for granted, so we don't value it as much as probably people from previous generations. And at the same time, we had the technological shock that will allow autocracies to thrive. So it's a very weird spot to be in, because we don't feel anymore the threats of autocracies, because it's a distant memory. In most countries, autocracies are really, really a distant memory from other generations. And at the same time, we had these technological shocks that might help autocracies prevail. And because we are at this fine spot, I do believe that it's a clear risk for liberal democracies, not only from external factors, but also from internal factors, to be dismantled, or at least partially dismantled, or some of the principles of liberal democracies to be partially dismantled. And this can happen very slowly, by even with the excuse of fighting autocracies. We could easily be losing freedom of expression because with the reason, and the reason that is given to us is that we need to fight misinformation, or we need to fight the threat from illiberal autocracies. And so we need to limit freedom of expression, because we need to limit the capability of those autocracies to influence us. And we have seen that in social networks, in the way that we want to regulate social networks that in the end will take freedom of expression from everyone to limit the possibilities that illiberal autocracies might influence our democratic process. And but to finalize, just a word of hope, which is we spoke a lot about China as an emerging power and emerging economic power. In my classes that I used to taught in IEP, I always show one graph in one of the first classes, which is about the supposedly China economic success. China is still very far from being an economic success. Liberal democracies are a huge economic success. China is still far from that. And why do I say that? If we look at the very, very long term, that's how I believe we should look into these things. If we look at 4 or 5 centuries, China is still at one of the lowest points in terms of economic weight in the total world. So China is still at one of the very lowest points. It was a stronger economic power in the 19th century than it is now. Let's not speak about the 18th and the 17th century. China is still at one of the lowest points. What does this mean? This means that first, it has a lot to grow, to gain its historical average, to go back to its historical average. It still has a lot to grow in the future, just to average out, just to be at its historical average. But it also means that liberal democracies have gained a lot of power, a lot of economic power in the last 100 years. It has been completely unprecedented the way that Western civilization has grown economically, has gained power, economic power over the last 100 years. So liberal democracies are still the most successful, economically speaking, regime of all, but by far, okay? So the fact that this has changed slightly in historical terms over the last 10, 20 years does not mean that it is not still the best way to organize politically a country, specifically in terms of economic results. China, yes, indeed, has overtaken the US, but it has overtaken the US for one reason: it has 3 times more population. So if it's still, if you take into account the population, China is still very far from the economic success of other of liberal democracies. So the reproductive part of the system is still in favor of liberal democracies. Most countries still want to achieve what liberal democracies have achieved and not what China has achieved, and much less what Russia has achieved. So this is just, I'm sorry if all my points went in opposite directions. And just to end this, I do believe that democracies are not granted. There's nothing in history that tells us that democracies are granted. The lessons of history, what tells us exactly the opposite. Autocracies have been more resilient. But the 2 arguments, the technological progress and the example of China, do not seem to me strong enough to state that for sure democracies are at risk. We've had much stronger technological shocks in the past that have been overcome, and more than that, that generated more strength towards liberal democracies. And the prime example of an illiberal autocracy, which is China, is yet to prove that can be more successful than liberal democracies, at least in economic terms.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Professor José Tomás, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me, of course, congratulate this team for this research project and the book. I'm extremely honored to not only to be here with you in this panel, but also to belong to the same team as these fellow colleagues, not only the senior ones, but the junior ones as well. It is also a delight to be here discussing this panel with my good friend Carlos Guimarães Pinto, who has put up an enormous effort for this country in the recent years, as you probably all know. Well, without further ado, because there are too many ideas and too few minutes to talk about them, I've brought a few ideas of my own, but I will let them go because what has been said here is worth of highlighting and discussion. Well, to start with, Bill Hasselberger's recollection of the other Bill's, Clinton's speech, when he reminded us of how mistaken his predictions were. Well, I'm afraid that on this subject, our predictions, whatever they may be, are destined to be mistaken as well because of the subject matter itself. He also raised this point of technology not leading to liberalization. Well, and I believe that this is the core point of all this that we are discussing here. And on that view, I would like to, well, not to bring into the discussion, but to suggest to those who would like to pursue this discussion elsewhere, to reread authors who are not liberal by any means, but authors like Ernst Jünger and Martin Heidegger, who suggested that technology was a different subject matter in itself, and it could be viewed as a kind of a Trojan horse of not what we call the artificial world, but nature itself within the human realm. And that I find a very interesting idea. I'm jumping from one idea to the other. Then Bill Hasselberger's recollected us what is now common in China, all these internet censorship, all these CCTV cameras, mass surveillance structure that is implemented and ongoing, the tracking of people, cars, etc. And then he referred to what is more important, is the fact that all this information is being centralized in a centralized data bank. And this, of course, is what promotes and feeds the social credit system. Well, this may seem very odd for us because we are, although we are, well, most of us are Portuguese and we live on this very small country in the west of Europe, but well, we tend to say that we live in the West, the free world, and this is somewhat strange to us. Well, as Bill, I am much more inclined to philosophy than to international relations or geopolitics or all these very interesting things that they discuss. So I'm also, I got reminded of another philosopher who said actually that he was not a philosopher. He did not consider himself to be a philosopher, but he's Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham put up this idea of the panopticon. And within the center of the panopticon, there was this institution, which was to be personalized, which what he called the central register. And what the central register was supposed to do was exactly this. Now, we are all accustomed to this idea through probably George Orwell's 1984, or perhaps not the book, but from the reality shows referring to the Big Brother, etc. We tend to misconceive what the Big Brother is. The Big Brother is not someone watching over you, it is everyone watching over everyone else. So again, I would like to bring this idea into the table. Another one is the fact that these technologies are being used by, in his words, wealthy high-tech autocracies. And of course, there comes Hayek's argument on inefficiency. And Carlos, in a way, stressed it a bit, and this goes in line with a bit with what he was saying regarding China. Now, can all this new tech prove Hayek to be wrong? Well, I believe so, in the sense that what Hayek argued is that there was no one capable of processing all of the information. And even if there was one capable of processing all this information, he could not replicate the diversity of all the agents in the market producing their own decisions. Well, to say this in 2021 is not to understand what technology is now capable of. So my view is much gloomier than theirs, I'm afraid. So regarding the question, can democracies stay entrepreneurial, innovative, open in a world of centralized information? Well, I not only tend to reply negatively, but I have the feeling that the question is a bit misplaced, and perhaps I can get back to it. But I would like to also yes, minutes are running out. I would also like to refer to Constanza's papers, and of course, starting with the classical reference to Schmitter and all this consensus of the retreat of democracies. Well, I will not contest that. I would just like to rephrase the problem in the sense that what they are saying is that technology is, in a sense, undermining democracies. Well, in my view, what technology is undermining is not democracies, it is liberty. Personal liberty, individual liberty. That is what is being undermined, not exactly the political regime. And I'm afraid that we may have some bad news regarding to that in the near future. And of course, this leads us to another philosophical question, which is the classical one. What is liberty? And in my view, the classical, orthodox, liberal reply to this question is a bit flawed. And for students of political theory, I would suggest, and of course this is just a suggestion, I would suggest that they look back not to Locke, but to Hobbes. And yes, Bentham as well. They can be, in my view, much more enlightening than the classical liberals on this subject. And of course, for those who may be curious about Hobbes, well, I'm referring to that idea of the subject is the freedom of the subject is in deliberation. It is in that process. And that process, according to neuroscientists, is a very quick and short one. It is timed in milliseconds. So neuroscience is now the new barrier to understand what freedom may be. No, and I cannot avoid saying a few comments on what Carlos just said, which is very, very interesting, especially his comparison to between the internet and the radio, television, etc. And of course, autocracies in the first half of the 20th century gave a lot of attention to all these new media. And of course, I will not lecture you on that, but just to highlight, I would name names like Leni Riefenstahl and Sergei Eisenstein, and how they were, how important they were both to the Nazi and the communist regime, and they understood the power of cinema and the moving image very, very soon, and better than we in the free democracies, perhaps. But of course, that's another topic for you to explore if you'd like. But the question is that this is broadcasting. And what we are facing today is a different problem. It is not the problem of broadcasting, it is the problem of deep learning, artificial machine deep learning. And this changes the subject completely in the sense that we are no longer the subjects of information, we are the assets of information. So we are assets for this information age. So, of course, we all like to think of ourselves as citizens first and foremost, but technology is looking at us as assets. And, well, I wouldn't like to end on a gloomy note than Carlos, but since he brought us a note of hope at the end, I would like to bring us down a little bit. I'm on a bad day today, I'm sorry. And just to say that, yes, of course, I agree with him. How could I not? But the problem is here, I believe, that we are facing today is not China, though China may be the elephant in the room, and what a big elephant it is. Or it is not China or any other country. The problem is technological. And I would dare to say that the problem is technology itself. And so it is, well, on that point, not a very human one, but technological that I would like to end and offer you all to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are running a bit out of time, but we still have around 15 minutes for a couple of questions from the audience. And I would, okay, we have 2 already, Cesar. I would just like to ask if they can be very, very concise so that we can still have time for a last round through all speakers. So Professor John Owen, please.
Thank you. Thank you. This is such a stimulating session. And I'm very sorry you said be brief, but because I have things to say about everything. But I will focus on two things. I think Bill should title this paper High Tech Beats Hayek, question mark. Emphasis on the question mark. More seriously, let's see, pulling together, I want to mostly talk about Constanza and Carlos, pull these things together, talk about evolutionary biology, but bring in ideas that maybe Carlos doesn't accept, of coevolution, writers like Richard Lewontin and others who emphasize the agency of organisms and populations vis-a-vis the environment. That is to say, organisms can shape the environment so that it then feeds back, it alters the direction of evolution. And this is accidental in the case of animals and plants. But if you apply coevolutionary logic to social evolution and cultural and political evolution, you can, and you look at international relations, you can think, well, nations, especially very large hegemonic countries, have agency, possibly, and I would say do, have agency in shaping the environment and steering evolution in particular directions. And in this is one reason why China is so important, and Russia to a lesser extent, Constanze's paper. We all intuit, I think, that there's a lot at stake in the fact that China is a rising power and is not becoming a democracy. It is, in fact, becoming more entrenched as an authoritarian country. We also intuit, and I'm an American, so I would say this, but I sense when I talk to Europeans also an intuitive sense that it's not good for global democracy if the United States stops being a democracy or the United States gets too weak or too uncommitted. And so the intuition, I think, is correct, and we can put some theoretical foundation beneath it if we think about it in terms of coevolution. That is to say, the United States, in concert with its democratic allies since the Second World War, has manipulated the international environment to make it friendlier, to select for democracy and free market economics. And it's done this deliberately. And China likes part of that system, but wants to remove the bias toward liberal democracy and shape the environment in a different way. And so that's the bad news. China is gaining leverage by the day. And by the way, I don't blame China for doing. They're doing what comes naturally. That they want to preserve their own regime, and they want a world that supports their regime. But the West has agency as well, and so I would like to leave us on a note of hope. It's not optimism, but more hope, that if the West really refocuses and recommits and reforms the liberal international order and all these bits of the environment that we've been shaping, and the United States needs to get its act together clearly. There is hope going forward, even when you embrace an evolutionary model. I think, for example, authoritarianism has thrived in the past when you've had big hegemonic authoritarian states that manipulate their environment. Democracy has flourished when the United States, for all of its mistakes and hypocrisies, has shaped the environment in the favor of democracy. And so going forward, I think one way to think about this is to look at it that way, that the West still has a lot of leverage, a lot of wealth, a lot of power, and it can use it if it's smart. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess there was, yeah.
Good afternoon to the panel. My name is Hugo Antunes, and I'm a first-year student from the EAP. If I follow correctly, Mr. Hasselberger, if I remember correctly, yes. If I follow the logic or his presentation correctly, I understand and I agree that democratic systems are not actually perfect and fixed systems. And taking that in consideration, my question to the whole board would be, could China and its RAP, instead of being seen only as a threat and challenge to the democratic system, also be seen as an opportunity for the democratic system to maybe innovate, renew, or even change its own system? Thank you.
Thank you. We will now make a final round with all of our speakers, and we will ask all of you to speak only for 2 minutes. And we will start again with Professor José Tomás. Yeah, okay, Carlos then.
Oh, Carlos, yes, Carlos.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't listening. I lost there for a moment. I'll give just 3 very quick notes in 2 minutes. I think when we speak about Hayek and the calculation problem in socialism, how would technology change that? I have an additional advantage here that I've worked with big data, with predictive models as in my previous life. And I must say, using social network data, so I must say that that will only solve Hayek's calculation problem I'll say new technology will only solve that entirely if we assume that human beings are pure algorithms. The only way that it would work is if human beings are pure algorithms. And if that's the case, we have a much bigger issue with a much bigger philosophical issue than the economic or the political issue. Then I'll be more worried for different reasons than the future of politics or economics. If human beings are just algorithms, that will have very different implications, and I would rather not even think about that. Very interesting, the point about evolution and the possibility of agency. I do believe you're right to think about that, that we are able to shape our environment so much that, you know, as Andre said in the beginning, I launched a think tank that's supposed to protect the values of liberal democracy. That's the main goal of the think tank. If I didn't believe that we could shape it, I wouldn't have launched it. But I think, and this goes to my third point, the ability of liberal democracies to shape that is much more limited than the autocracies, because the weaponry that liberal democracies have, the tools that liberal democracies have, are much more limited than those that autocracies have. Because if we use some tools that might be in the future needed to protect liberal democracies, we might stop being a liberal democracy. There's a certain tools that as liberal democracies we cannot use, wage wars, different ways of waging wars, of using information, of manipulating citizens, that autocracies have those tools and liberal democracies do not have them unless they stop being liberal democracies. So in order to protect liberal democracies, you might need tools that will transform you in an illiberal democracy. And that, I believe, it's the reason why, yes, we can play as agents, but only to a certain limit, where the fact that we are liberal democracies gives us an evolutionary disadvantage in itself. Sorry, I just wanted to answer the questions. I really have no final message. I have more questions than answers to all of this. Thank you for listening to my questions.
Thank you. Constanza?
Well, I definitely agree with Professor John Owen. I do think that this time has a particular gravity to it, with all technological issues, but also obviously economic and social issues that arise. Yeah, I would say so, and I completely agree that I think the United States has to kind of get a grip on that and control that. And I would also say that, you know, as the hegemon of the LIO, I do believe that the resilience of the LIO is very crucial to the long-term, to the longevities of liberal democracies. And just to say that I think it's an opportunity for Europe as well, you know, especially with the technological issues, to be a sort of a standard of, to provide codes of conduct that are a bit more people-oriented and liberty, that actually try to preserve liberty, you know, as Hasselberger just added. About China being an opportunity, I guess it's an opportunity for Europe, because for liberal democracies, because in a way it threatens their existence, or you know, politically, ideologically. The idea that they create these, I think my presentation kind of addresses that, you know, the fact that they create, you know, alternative institutional arrangements and alternative regime types that seem very attractive for countries that are transitioning. You know, they might, in Africa we see this happening a lot, you know, countries that would be expected to transition to democracies kind of had their path deterred and deviated. So yes, I think it's an opportunity for liberal democracy to evaluate how they have been conducting maybe foreign affairs as well, trying to engage from the ground up and just organic processes. Yeah, I think it's an opportunity from that perspective, I would say.
Thank you, Constanza. Professor Francisco, your turn now.
Just a few words. A very interesting debate. Only with the introduction and one chapter of the book. Now imagine the discussion after reading all the book. So you must read the book, and then we'll be back here to discuss. Many thanks.
Thank you. Professor José Tomás, I don't know if you want to...
Yes, may I? Well, another very, very interesting question Carlos just put. Are we pure algorithms? Now, I would like to stress how he put this question. He didn't ask, are we algorithms? He asked, are we pure algorithms? In a way, this entails that there is a lot in us that is, reconducive to algorithms, just as perhaps as one medical doctor was once joking with me in the sense that we are all bionic beings, not all of us, but most of us are bionic beings in the sense that a lot of us have, spare parts, artificial parts in us that help us live better. And try and look at this way. There are internal parts in me, like the mesh is because of the hernias, etc., that we have inside or in teeth, etc. And they are internal, or perhaps this is external. So this is the world that we're living in. So these questions, which are fundamental questions, are very, very important. And I would dare you to, in the research team, to pursue these questions. Do not ask me to join the research team, but I will gladly be here discussing this with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bill, I think we're finishing with you.
Okay, great, thank you. So I just wanted to say one thing about the question about whether China could be seen as an opportunity as well as a challenge. I think the answer is yes in a variety of respects. I think there are potential, as other people at this forum have pointed out, there is potential for cooperation on important issues that require the assistance and aid of China. Major issues in climate change and other things that it would be a huge support to work with on that point. And further, I think that we in the West tend to think of political legitimacy in terms of popular sovereignty, right? It's the leadership class is legitimate to the extent that they've been voted for by the people, or they represent the people, or they, we have Lockean and liberal views of the origin of legitimacy. China is articulating a different view, or the leadership is articulating a different view that they refer to as performance legitimacy or outcome legitimacy, which is that the legitimate regime and the legitimate leadership class is the one that can produce the best outcomes and the best performances. And they point out that the West has not been particularly great, at least in the last decade or so, on this point. And that's, I think, you can see that as a useful challenge, intellectual and social and political challenge for the West to do better, to show, well, why is it exactly that democracies are good places to live in? Why do they have vibrant cultural life and art scenes? And what is it about a democracy? Can we make it perform better? I mean, we have to match that sort of performance criteria as well. And then finally, I would say AI competition with China can be beneficial as well, right? So AI can be used to generate propaganda and mass monitoring, but AI can also be used to identify propaganda and bots. And so, it's maybe a little bit strange to think of technology to solve problems caused by technology, as some of my students have pointed out, but there is a role for that kind of phenomenon, for using AI to attempt to ameliorate some of the problems that these new technologies have themselves produced. And so competition, superpower AI competition, as a recent book is titled, may actually bring some challenges, but also some benefits to the world as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we close the session, we are on time. Let me remind you, we will have the group photo at 6:15 at the garden. So Professor Spada would not forgive me if I forgot to mention this. So please, after the session, calmly but orderly proceed for the garden photo. Having made this reminder, I'd like to thank everyone who attended the session and all the contributions, and particularly our speakers and discussants and chair. Thank you very much.